Welcome to Understanding the Risk Management Mandates in 2024 Cybersecurity Regulations with James Tarala. A copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing in about 24 hours on the webcast registration page. We ask that you please drop any questions you have throughout the presentation into Zoom's Q&A feature, where James will do his best to cover them all by the end. Thank you.
Glad everybody could be here today. My name is James Tralla. I'm one of the instructors here at the SANS Institute. I've had the privilege of being here quite a few years now, going over a little bit over 20 years, 25 years now here at SANS, and just enjoy the opportunity to give some of these presentations to everyone and talk a little bit about some of the research that I'm working on, some of the things that students are asking me questions about, and use this as an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on in our field. As a lot of you know, like I said, I've been here at SANS a long time, work at a lot of other organizations, volunteered at the Center for Internet Security, had the privilege of being one of the authors for the CIS controls for maybe 12 or 13 years. Nowadays, I do a lot of volunteer work over at the Cybersecurity Risk Foundation, working on some of those resources that are there, as well as teaching for SANS and other projects. So this presentation that we're going to be giving today is on the risk management regulations, the mandates that have come out here in recent regulations. Basically said, not all of the regulations we're going to talk about are regulations that have come out in 2024 specifically, but there are things that are applicable in 2024 that we're getting lots of requests from clients to talk about, explain, and try to give some clarity on. And so we may not hit every regulation or your favorite regulation. If we don't today, there's a lot out there. There's literally in the hundreds of these things now. If you have questions about that, I'm more than happy to take things offline and maybe answer some things specifically after the fact. But want to make sure that we try to get through as much of the content or the concepts of it as we possibly can as we go through the presentation today. To be clear, I've been giving a lot of these presentations this year, and really what it comes down to is there's a bunch of new research we've been working on, new ideas we want to get out there. We think we have opportunities to help organizations solve problems. There's been a lot of questions about cybersecurity risk management. There's been a lot of conversations about what it means, how to clarify it, just to be specific about it, and there's been a lot of ambiguity in this space. And I've wanted to use these presentations almost as fireside chats. I've gotten that feedback quite a few times in my presentations at SANS that sometimes my presentations are sort of that view. I wanted to be cozy presentations that you can sit down and enjoy, maybe learn a little bit from, and hopefully that'll be something we can do here today as well. The one thing I would be clear on, I'm not an attorney. I'm a cybersecurity professional. Like I said, I've been doing this a lot of years. And one of the things I've been doing for at least 20 some years now is focusing on the regulatory environment and understanding cybersecurity standards. So that's going to be a big part of the conversation, but please understand, I'm not an attorney. The things that we talk about as you're thinking about being compliant with law, please consult your attorney. That's a good just conversation. Even if you're the one educating them, I think it's still good to have that conversation with your legal teams. So I would definitely encourage you to do that as we get into this. Just to get started though today, I want to talk a little bit about the present reality and kind of get into some of this understanding of the regulations that are out there. And like we just talked a second ago, what Hayes said was, we're going to go through and I want to present this information to you. I will leave some time for Q&A at the end. I'll try to. I'm not always great about that, but I'll try to. And so if you have questions at the end, please post those in Q&A and I'll try to do my best to answer those. And if we don't have time, I mean, we'll just, I'll give you my email address at the very end and we can go ahead and answer things that way as well. But I'll remind you about that at the end. So the challenge that we're facing is that this issue of cybersecurity, this issue of cybersecurity threats, addressing threat actors, threat actions that are going on, this is a continuous issue. I think we're all pretty sold on the fact this isn't going away anytime soon. It's something that we keep hearing about. We keep hearing more and more in the news about it. I was literally just hearing some things over this weekend where there's some conversation about economic realities and the potential of cyber attacks to cause problems in certain parts of the world. And that's the reality. We saw literally the country of Norway this past weekend. I thought it was kind of interesting this past week, actually put out flyers to their population, to their citizens, and basically said, listen, there are things going on economically, there are things going on geopolitically around us, and the potential of cyber threats are real, and so you need to be prepared. And they actually gave their normal citizens just advice of what to do with the potential of that coming out. So it's the kind of thing that we're constantly talking about, we're constantly reading about. And this isn't like a fear, uncertainty, and doubt conversation. I think it's just the present reality. It's the thing that we say, there's a certain amount of cyber hygiene we need to have in place so we make sure that our organizations, and maybe even us personally, can be successful and safe in the things that we're doing. If we look at some of the statistics that are out there from groups like the FBI's IC3 and similar groups, what we see is a number of cybersecurity breaches that we're dealing with are going up every single year. This has been going up since basically the year 2002, since they've been tracking the study. And you can see just an increase year after year after year of both the number of breaches that are reported and then the dollar value loss that comes out of these. So the thing that I always take away from some of these studies is what we're working on isn't going away anytime soon. And so a lot of organizations lack that understanding of what specifically needs to happen in order to address the challenges that are out there. And so what that leads to is as organizations take sort of a haphazard approach or an ad hoc approach to dealing with cybersecurity threats, then what happens is as these breaches continue, because we don't have really solid ways to address what's in front of us. So regulatory bodies say, well, if people don't know what hygiene looks like, if they don't know what those specific things are that they need to do, then we'll step in and we'll tell people what those things are to help make sure that they do those. And so specifically one of the conversations that have been coming up a lot in the last, say, 12 to 18 months has been this issue of how do we address cybersecurity risk management as part of a due diligence process? Now, I think a lot of times, if we're just honest and we look at what these regulatories are asking for, it's a bit unclear. I'm not picking on them. It's just I think our industry as a whole hasn't really settled on what that means. But I think we've all heard this phrase that we need to be doing cybersecurity risk management. So the thought process is, well, let's do it, right? Why not add it to a regulation? It seems like a logical thing to do, which I don't disagree. It's something that we probably all should be doing. And I would argue that probably most every organization benefits from doing that kind of a process. However, having said that, it's also been very unclear from these regulators what exactly they mean. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. So we're going to talk about the regulations themselves. We're going to talk about the standards that are asking you to do these things. But I also want to work through the definitions, because the reality is, as I look at some of these regs, what I'm finding more and more is the regulators aren't clear and they're not consistent on what they mean when they say the words cybersecurity risk assessment or cybersecurity risk management. And so what I want to do is give us some definitions, and I'm going to give you, in fact, 3 different definitions that I'm seeing consistently used. And that way, when you read those words, you know what we're talking about. All right, so for the sake of bandwidth and some of that, I'm not going to share my video the entire time. I just know that I'll run out of bandwidth here eventually. And just to keep you guys focused and on track, we'll sort of turn that off here for just a bit. So the thing that I think about, first of all, is if I'm working with an organization and I'm working with business leadership and I'm working with, say, an executive leadership team, or I'm working with, say, a cybersecurity task force or advisory committee or steering committee, whatever you want to call it, and we're working together to try to understand what are the things we should be doing to help the organization achieve its objectives. Basically, what we're going to say is we're going to say, all right, we need to define what are the things as an organization we need to do in order to make sure we get to achieve our mission, right? So cybersecurity threats aren't realized, technology continues to operate the way we expect it to operate, those kinds of things. There's basically 3 areas that I identify in these conversations that I think we want to probably start with. Now, in the old days, I think what you found was, a lot of organizations would just simply identify with a particular regulation or a particular standard. So, for instance, you might say, well, listen, I'm a healthcare company, I'm a hospital, I'm clinical, so I need to do HIPAA, I need to do high tech, right? And you would hear lots of organizations say that, especially like early 2000s. You'd hear people say those words. Or as people got into some of the more popular standards, people might say, well, I'm a state agency or I'm a federal agency, so I need to look at NIST, SP 853. Or as time went on, people might say, you know what, I really like the NIST cybersecurity framework, or I really like the CIS controls. And people would sort of identify with a particular standard that was out there. And that was really actually pretty common. But the reality is that there's so many of these different requirements that are being thrown at us. Some of them are requirements, right? So regulatory requirements, et cetera. Some of them are just things we think we should be doing. And so if it's me, what I tend to think about this is I tend to break this down into 3 different areas. Number one, I say, as an organization, you need to understand what are the laws and regulations that apply to you. And this is a great conversation for your attorney, right? Go to them and say, listen, what are the things that we have to do in order to make sure that we stay in compliance and we stay out of trouble with the regulators? And so there should be a list likely somewhere of what are the standards, what are the laws, what are the regs that you believe you need to follow as an organization? What does that list look like? Secondly, I would say that we need to understand, are there also things that we've agreed to do? So again, it's not just law, but are there contracts out there where we said, you know what, listen, we've agreed we're going to do this thing by contract, and there could be contractual um, problems or constraints or obligations if we don't meet those terms, right? Maybe the terms change, maybe we default on contracts. There's lots of consequences sometimes to that side of it. The example I'll give a lot of times to people is the payment card international PCI standard, the data security standard, right? PCI DSS. It's not a law. Well, I mean, technically in the state of Nevada, there's kind of a weird state thing going on there, but that's a side note. But for the most part, PCI is really not law, really much of anywhere. However, having said that, if you want the ability to process cards and you want to be able to do transactions that way, and you want to keep your rates the way that they are, there's a good chance you're going to have to follow that standard because you've agreed to it by contract, right? So it's not a requirement, it's not law, but you've contractually obligated yourself to that. Or a lot of times we're seeing standards or contracts come out with data breach notification requirements. So you have a strong partnership with someone and you want to make sure that your data is protected with that person. You might have an agreement that says, listen, if you lose our data, you're going to tell us, or vice versa, right? So you'll have that in a contract. It's very popular these days. But then on top of those things, you might say, okay, well, these are the things I'm being required to do. But probably most all of us say, as great as that is to have these requirements, or at least sort of some guideposts here, it's typically not everything we want to do to defend ourselves. So there's probably going to be things out there. Again, what I've heard a lot of people say is, well, maybe by law I have to follow the New York's NYDFS, NYCR 500 requirements, but by contract I have to follow PCI. But neither of those is all comprehensive. So I want to use, I don't know, CIS controls or NIST CSF or whatever it might be to augment what those standards are requiring me to do, because I think they give me the best chance of actually being successful. So it's kind of a combination of those three things. And so if you're going out and determining for yourself what your safeguard library looks like, you're probably going to look at a combination of those three things in order to make that decision. And the reality is we're seeing more and more and more of these requirements, these standards, these contractual requirements, just new frameworks coming out, whatever it is. And often what we're seeing is organizations are asked to not just follow one of these or two of these. There's a good chance you might be asked to follow 7, 12, or more of these, depending on what kind of industry you're in. So again, it's very, very common to see this regulatory landscape growing, and it seems like it's only getting worse. And it seems like more and more you're seeing just a volume of these standards come out. And the other thing that I would say is more and more these are becoming prescriptive. If you look at some of the early standards, again, I'll just use HIPAA as an example, it was very broad, very vague about what it was actually asking people to do. And you compare that to some of the new things that are coming out in 2023 or 2024, they're getting quite specific, to be sure. So again, just things to be aware of as you're looking at defining standards for yourself. So if we look at some of these new things, one of the things we're seeing specifically, and why I was asked to do this webcast is to talk specifically about some of the risk management requirements, is that there's been a lot of requirements coming out in 23 and 24 that are asking organizations to perform regular cybersecurity risk assessments. And so really what I want to focus our presentation on here today is if we have an understanding of what our baseline is, what are the standards, right? So you go out there and you list the laws, the regulations, the standards you have to follow. You've got that list agreed upon. Then if we look inside of those, what are the specific requirements for risk management, for risk assessment? What are they really getting at? Because there's a lot of things we could talk about, right? We could talk about, I don't know, maintaining risk registers. We could talk about how we choose safeguards and what that threat modeling process would look like. We could talk about third-party risk management, right? So there's all kinds of potential topics that fit in there, but what are these things actually asking us to do? So let's get into that specifically. Most of these requirements don't specify who does these. In other words, does this have to be done by an internal party? Do you have to hire a third party to come in and do the work? And that question has come up a lot. There are some of the older requirements that ask organizations to perform pen tests, and sometimes those are asking you to have third parties do those pen tests or do validation. But most of the things that have been coming out in the last year or two are fairly vague and ambiguous about who actually does the work. So there's been some conversation amongst people that I've talked to, at least sort of in that regulatory space, who have suggested that there might be value in having third parties at least once a year come in and do an assessment. Just that way you can sort of check a box with regulators that says, listen, we not only took this seriously, but we hired someone to do the work for us. So that way, if we were biased or we were less than independent, we have that sort of that statement or that report that says, listen, we had an assessment performed, and these were the results of that assessment. So that's something that, again, it's not necessarily being required of anybody, but at the same time, I am seeing organizations doing it just as like a safety net kind of approach. So, but just again, from a purely from a very specific standpoint, from a strict reading of the rules perspective, again, I just want you to see, again, there's not a lot of requirements there as far as who is doing that. So just to kind of give you some confidence there. However, there are a lot of these requirements that are explicitly stating that it must be senior business stakeholders that are processing the results of the information. So when we're talking about who, right, which is kind of what I get started with on this, is it doesn't say who has to perform the assessment. If it's a control self-assessment, if it's something a lot of you like to use the IIA, the Institute of Internal Auditors or IIA's three-line model. So if this is a first line, a GRC committee like a second line, or your internal audit team, a third line, it could literally be any of those doing that. It could be even external parties. But the people who process the information are going to be people, and oftentimes they're going to be asked, are going to be at the leadership level. And I think the state of New York's requirements are sort of a good example of this, where they ask you not only to perform the assessment and report the results, but they ask specifically that there be a chief information security officer or a governing body from the business side that's going to process the results of that information. And oftentimes there's sort of this expectation or thought process that C-level executives, boards of directors would be included in that. And again, whether the regulations that apply to you are that specific or not, which again, most aren't that super specific, but they do want business stakeholders involved. I think most of the clients that I'm working with are trying to take this information and get it in front of leadership so they're aware of where things are. And frankly, I would argue that's kind of the point of why we're doing a lot of this work is we as cybersecurity professionals or engineers or people involved in risk assessments, we want to make sure the results of the work that we're doing is put in front of leadership so they can make better decisions with that information. And so again, just getting in front of them, I think is valuable. And frankly, most of the assessment work that we do, we sort of wrap up and conclude with a report and presentation to business leadership at a high level. Now, as far as actually scoping this out, it seems to me that there's basically two scopes of who is being assessed, right? So we're talking about sort of the very beginning of these projects and thinking about who does the work, who gets reported to. We also have to sort of think about who is being assessed. And there's basically two main contexts that I seem to see over and over in these regulations. One is the regulated organization itself. So if you're an organization that's processing sensitive information, personally identifiable information, PII, or whatever that might be, there's a good chance you need to do an assessment of yourself, of your corporate, your IT, whatever you want to call that. And at the same time, the second scope we're seeing is there's a lot of regulations that have been very, very trendy since about 2018 to see regulations start to ask for third party or supply chain risk assessments be performed. Most often, this is done in the context of third party risk management. You see a lot of conversations about that. The things we're going to do, I should say philosophically, the process we're going to follow is going to be pretty much the same in both. We'll get into that here in just a minute. But the target, right, the who, or maybe even the resources we expend during an assessment might be different for third parties. So, for example, if we do an assessment of ourselves, likely you're going to put a pretty decent amount of effort into that to make sure you have a good view of what risk exists. On the other hand, if we're doing that of a third party, it's sort of assumed that you're not going to put the same energy into a third party that you put into yourself. And I would even maybe argue, based on the criticality of that third party, you might put different degrees of investment into that risk assessment process. It's not expected that those are necessarily going to be as in depth as what we see from the regulated organization itself. But in both of these scopes primarily are going to be talking about the validation of the cybersecurity safeguards that are in place. And we'll get into those definitions here just momentarily. But the thought is, again, is the organization that we've scoped, Have they implemented appropriate safeguards to help the organization achieve its goals? And that's kind of the key, right? So whichever of these scopes we're dealing with, if you're looking at yourself, if you're looking at a third party, business partner, whatever, again, are you implementing safeguards to help the organization achieve its goals? That's the core thing that we're thinking about here in the context of these regulations. Now, let's look a little bit, before we get into the definitions, let's talk a little bit about scope. Now, one of the research projects that I've been involved with for the last few years, probably about maybe 4 years, maybe 5 years now, has been some work over at the Cybersecurity Risk Foundation, or CRF. And one of the things that we've done over there is we've built a database of a lot of the regulations and standards, sort of the more popular ones that are out there, so that we can facilitate mappings between them and just facilitate analysis of these standards and such. It's really been a helpful tool for me, at least, especially in the research that I've been working on, because it allows me to have sort of a bigger view of all the standards in a more normalized way. And we'll talk more about that here a little bit in the context of some of these some of the tools and resources we're going to give you here in just a minute. But one of the cool things it allowed me to do was go through and query a lot of these standards in our database and try to understand what are some of those standards that are specifically calling out risk assessments or risk management practices as a part of the standard. Because sometimes you'll see it's implied, and sometimes we see that it's required, right? So you have to kind of look through these and see, what are those requirements itself? And I guess I want to get specific in this presentation and make sure that we're as we're going through this process, that we're going to be able to see examples of where some of these requirements are out there. So you'll see examples of that here. Again, just some of them. I'm not going to go through and read all these to you. And there's more than even just this, but I just wanted to give you some of the big ones that a lot of you are probably talking about or may have come up in conversations, just to give you some ideas. Now, that being said, let me read not all the statements to you, but let me give you sort of a taste of the standards themselves, right? So this is the actual wording from some of these standards. And then what I want to do is take that information and parse it for you. And I'm not going to lie, like that's always been one of my pet peeves, that when someone writes a standard or a regulation or a requirement and somebody else has to parse it or interpret it, not going to lie, probably one of my biggest irritations. So sadly, in this area, this is one of those times we're going to have to do that. So let me go through and show you some examples of some of the specific requirements, and then let's parse these and try to understand what are they really asking you to do? Because there's basically three things they're going to ask you to do. So we're going to get into all three of those here today. So again, some of this can be available for reference because I'm going to do this fast. Like Hayes said, we're going to make this information available to you after the presentation. So again, if I go through this part fast, please just go back and reference it later. If you look at NIST 800-171, an example here, periodically assess the risk to organizational operations, assets, and individuals resulting from the operation of organizational systems and the associated processing, storage, or transmission of controlled unclassified information. All right, so basically assess the risk to organizational operations, right, and those things. ISO 27002 asks you to do an independent review of information security. Okay. They also ask for compliance with policies, rules, and standards for information security. Okay. Well, those will make more sense in a minute. But again, at a high level, they're asking you to do those reviews. That's been around for quite a while on the ISO IEC side. Cloud Security Alliance has some good ones here. Conduct independent audit and assurance assessments according to relevant standards at least annually. And then perform independent audit and assurance assessments according to risk-based plans and policies. One of the things that you're going to see in some of these is there's a conversation about risk assessment. There's a conversation about assessment. They're going to have a conversation about audit. And I get asked a lot about, well, what's the difference between these? And in my opinion, you're going to see, for the most part, my short answer to that definition is the person who does the work. It's really, in my opinion, that simple. And it has to do with that independence. So again, I don't want to go into a whole long conversation here, but just as a quick answer for some folks, again, if we're using the IIA, right, the Institute of Internal Auditors three-line model, many of you know they have those three different lines. They have first line, which is more operations, more IT oriented engineering kind of roles. Second line, which is more governance, more compliance, right, more oversight roles. And then they have third line, which is that audit role. If we're talking about an audit, to me, we're doing these assessments under the context of third line. If we're doing an assessment, It could be, again, same exact work that's done, same scope of the project and everything, but it's just done by first or second line. And we're talking about risk assessments. It could mean that exact same thing, or there's two other definitions I'll give you here momentarily. Also, PCI DSS says implement a risk assessment process. Okay, so same theory, right? Very similar to what ISO is saying. NYDFS, again, going back to NC or NYCRR 500, every covered entity shall conduct a periodic risk assessment, right, of the covered entity's information systems. Such risk assessment shall be updated as reasonably necessary to address changes, et cetera. So again, regular risk assessment, right? So you see this statement over and over and over again. If you look at the SCCA requirements, right, the organization should ensure a risk assessment is also carried out for the organization development, test, and training environments. So again, you're seeing these common statements that do an assessment, and that, in summary, that seems to be the main conversation that most of these regulations are going to get at. Is they're going to talk about perform an assessment. Now, sometimes they're going to talk about an assessment sort of generically, and what they probably mean is of yourself. And then there are going to be some requirements that come out and say, do that same work with a third party or your supply chain. Okay, so again, it's who is the scope of that? The work is the same, but who's the target? Who's the scope? Who is the person being assessed, right? That might differ. It might be yourself, it might be a third party, like I said. So what it comes down to then is there are three definitions that I see over and over again of what that term risk assessment means, depending on which standard you're talking about. Now, I'm not giving this talk to pick on anybody. I'm just trying to give you guys feedback, definitions, hopefully to be able to make this more practical so that when you go back to your organizations, you actually know exactly what it is you should be doing. So again, not to pick on anybody, but the best examples I have is the NYDFS NYCRR 500 Amendment 2 that came out last year. In the process of reading that document, what you'll find is it's not very long. It's actually probably one of the shorter documents. It's pretty targeted, and it's actually good that way, right? One of the things I like is there's a lot of standards and regulations that are coming out here in the last few years that are super targeted and just trying to get people to do a basic requirement of due care, due diligence. And it's sort of the main thing that they're asking you to do. And by that, what I mean is they might only be asking you to do 5, 10, 15 things, but they're cyber hygiene focuses. I look at the UK Cyber Essentials, for example, is a really good example of that. Or the Australian, the ACSC requirements, the Essential 8, again, another really good example of that. NYCRR, I think, is sort of a longer version of that, but still in that context. Well, anyways, the NYDFS requirements, in the context of reading that document, you're going to see three different definitions of the word risk assessment. And that's just in one standard alone. And you're going to see the other standards sort of follow that lead, right? Because there is such confusion, I think, by a lot of organizations about what that term means that frankly, a lot of people just throw it around without clear definition. And in fact, it's funny. When I've got a couple of classes at SANS that I teach specifically on these subjects of risk assessment, risk management, the 419 and the 519 course, I actually encourage students in those courses not to actually to try to avoid using that word risk. And whenever they find that word about to come out of their mouth, I almost want you to think to yourself, okay, is there a better, more descriptive word I could use to be clearer about what I'm trying to actually accomplish here? So anyways, that being said, I really see three different definitions here that I can get us to think about in the context of this presentation. So the first one that we have here is risk management for the purpose of safeguard selection. And the theory of this definition says that we're going to use a risk-based process to define the safeguards, the controls that we believe should be in place in order for us to achieve our objectives. And you do see this requirement or this definition show up in a few of the standards. So you're trying to defend, let's say, a web application. All right, well, what safeguards do you need to defend that web application? And the thought process is there should be a risk-based process to make that decision. Now, a lot of the standards will directly say something to this effect, or at least imply that you should use a risk-based process in order to select these safeguards. Now, the challenge, though, is kind of understanding what that means. Now, at the Cybersecurity Risk Foundation, one of the things that we created, we've been maintaining a risk model for a lot of years, and In 2024, we really decided that we wanted to merge governance and risk in the same model. Because what we realized was that there were really, at the end of the day, risk overlaid governance. It's a longer conversation we have time for today. We're going to put out a new version in 2025. And what we're going to do in the 2025 version is we're going to go ahead and even simplify this a little bit more, I think. But the focus is going to continue to be that it's our belief that cybersecurity risk simply overlays the cybersecurity governance cycle, and there are different places in that cycle where we overlay it. One of those places is in the idea of the safeguard selection process. And so you sort of look on the far left of that model and you see safeguard selection on that bottom circle, the second one from the left, and you'll see that we have these different steps in that process. And if you want to learn more about this, again, you can go online and grab a copy of this document. It's a free download for you to read and learn more. But the point being here is that if you're looking at risk assessment and why you might want to do this, one of the things you can do is you can do risk assessment for the purpose of safeguard selection. Okay, and that's one of the things that we could do. Now, the reality is, though, and this is the part that I think that drives people a little bit crazy, and myself included, most organizations are not actually doing formal threat inventories, threat modeling, or safeguard prioritization activities based on any formal objective process. Now, don't get me wrong, we all have lists of good things we want to do. But if you ask me of my clients, what percent of my clients are doing formal threat modeling for the purpose of selecting cybersecurity defenses? Then the thing that I would tell you is the reality is almost no organization I work with is actually taking the time to do this. There are some, but I can probably count them on one hand, the number of organizations who are doing a formal process for this. And I'll say, even at CRF and the work that we're doing, it's a tough mental exercise to do threat modeling and threat taxonomies. We do have that work in place, but even we know we could improve the work that we're doing. And we just find that most organizations aren't really doing this. Most organizations, instead, what they do is when they're trying to figure out what are the safeguards we should be implementing, they outsource that, right? So they go to a standards body like NIST or ISO or SANS or CIS or whoever, and they say, well, what do you guys think we should do? And the risk-based process we follow is we basically go to these third parties and say, well, what do you think we should do? And we just do that. There's also these aggregate cybersecurity standards, like you'll see the CRF standard I'll show you here basically in a minute. Or you go to a cybersecurity consulting group and have them help you figure this out. But very rarely, if ever, do I see organizations have formal processes to doing this. It kind of drives me crazy because I feel like what's happening is we've almost made put this belief out there that, oh, this is something everybody's doing. And we almost shame people if they're not doing this thing when we realize full well that nobody is actually doing it. So it's kind of frustrating to me, I guess, as a practitioner, because I hate this idea that regulators or other cybersecurity professionals are shaming organizations for not doing the thing that no one actually is doing. And so I don't know. This is pet peeve of mine, but it is sort of one of those first things, right? Sometimes when people talk about, why do we do risk assessment? We do it for the purpose of figuring out what are the good things we should be doing. Now, having said that, if I were you and I was focusing my risk assessment activities, I would continue to do exactly what you're doing today. Don't try to come up with a threat modeling process first. Do that down the road. When you know your hygiene controls are in place and you've got a good foundation and you've got good due diligence there, you've paid off some of your tech debt, you want to explore threat modeling, send me an email and I'll send you some links. But until you feel really solid about the state of your hygiene, this is not something I would be focused on. Do the outsourcing like everybody says, because it's a way to get started. So again, said a different way, if your regulators come to you and you say that your risk assessment process for designing safeguards is to outsource to standards bodies to help you understand that list, I think that's perfectly acceptable for this day and age. That might change down the road, but at least for today, I feel like that's perfectly acceptable. The other thing that I see, which again is just a weird definition, again, which I don't love, is I see organizations define risk management as vulnerability management. In fact, I see it more than you might think. And it's just a weird definition. It's frankly, it's a bad definition. It's just not a good way to define these terms. So another way we could define cybersecurity risk management is in the context of doing regular vulnerability management or vulnerability scans. So again, if you look at NYDFS, if you look at PCI and look at a couple others, they're going to sort of interchange that word vulnerability assessment and risk assessment, and oftentimes sort of confuse the two of those. And then they say when vulnerabilities are discovered, like when you find a vulnerability, that you should have a risk-based process for prioritizing those vulnerabilities and then addressing or remediating the issues that are in place. There's not a ton of standards that require this or sort of use that word here. Now, there are regulations that ask you to do vulnerability management, but most of them don't confuse vulnerability management and risk management. Risk management and vulnerability management are two very different things. And so it bothers me again that we see this overlay of terms. It's like we've got bad semantics in place, but semantics actually matter, it turns out. So again, read the requirements there. Some of these requirements are going to say define safeguards using a risk-based process. And like I said a minute ago, that might be as simple as going to the standards bodies and asking them what you should be doing. Some of these standards are going to say, well, we want you to do good vulnerability management. And again, have a vulnerability assessment tool like a Tenable or Rapid7 or Qualys or whatever, and use that, scan your systems, use a risk-based process to remediate and fix what you discover. And again, what basically people are doing to implement this definition, really pretty simple, probably what most of you guys are already doing, but buy a vulnerability scanner, whatever that might be. I mean, I think most of us are fully aware. Most of these vulnerability scanners are going to be commercial tools now. Again, I mentioned Tenable, Rapid7, Qualys. I am seeing more and more companies start to use other tools, non-traditional vulnerability scanners. For example, Microsoft Defender, CrowdStrike, Wiz, Orca, Landsweeper. It's been interesting. There's been a lot of these sort of non-traditional tools that are out there that are starting to report on the presence of vulnerabilities or missing patches that exist in a lot of these platforms. So anyways, buy one of these tools or a couple of these tools if you want to, regularly scan your system for missing patches, and then use automated patch management tools to remediate the vulnerabilities. I mean, that's basically, I mean, I'm overly simplifying vulnerability management, of course, by doing that, but at a high level, that's what we're being asked to do. So again, if you think about this, there are some organizations that will extend this definition. Some organizations will say, okay, if we look at things like the Security Content Automation Protocol or SCAP, and we see SCAP defines how to do vulnerability management to look for coding weaknesses. Some will also utilize the SCAP definitions for configuration vulnerabilities or configuration weaknesses and include that in their scope, and then use some of the same tools to look for configuration-oriented vulnerabilities. Just to be completely honest, most of the regulations, most of the standards do not get to that depth. They'll make some generic statement that says scan your systems on a regular basis, use a risk-based approach to remediate what you discover, but they don't really get into the details of what you should be scanning. I'd say maybe the exception to that might be the Center for Internet Security and their CIS controls. They've got some definitions there that are a little bit more specific, but for the most part, you're not going to see a lot of specificity there, except just do these regular scans. So again, one definition you'll see for risk assessment, you do it for the purpose of safeguard selection. Another definition that we have out there is we do this for the purpose of vulnerability management and prioritizing remediation. The third one, and by far, this is that core definition, right? The core thing we see people doing is risk assessment for the purpose of safeguard validation. Now, if you ask me what 99% of the standards that are out there are asking you to do, this is it. So if you want to say, okay, let's just focus on one thing, what's the core thing, James? Help me really, really get my mind around this. If I was to give you a definition of risk assessment that I really see over and over again in these standards, it's that you're going to have a regular process to validate that appropriate safeguards have been implemented in your organization. Now, that sort of implies this idea that what you're going to find is that you have to choose appropriate safeguards in order to validate those safeguards, right? And I get that, right? So I guess this is sort of a two-pronged approach. But the thought process is really you decide what are the safeguards you should have in place. Now, if you're going to do a formal risk assessment process for that, fine. And if not, I'm actually okay with that too. But at the end of the day, you need to have a target state that you're using. So in other words, what set of safeguards are you assessing yourself against? All right, so said a different way, right? Organizations have to regularly validate that the safeguards they chose, they selected, have actually been implemented in their organization. And likely there's going to be places where you haven't done all the things that you thought you should do. And so it's a process of identifying those, having remediation plans, maybe using a risk register or something to track those. But again, this process could be applied to yourself, or you could apply it to a third party, right? If we come up with a list of, make it 100 things, and we say, we know these 100 things are super important to achieve our cybersecurity goals, we could do an assessment of ourselves and say, are we doing those 100 things? Are our third parties doing those 100 things, whatever that might be? So this is the definition. This is the one really. If I'm reading the regulations that are coming out, have we done some sort of assessment to make that happen? Now, again, if I look at the GRM, right, from CRF, you see on the left-hand side, right, that wheel for safeguard selection. And if you see on the right-hand side, we see another one there, which is for the purpose of safeguard validation. And that's, again, if I could really say, where's the majority of our risk assessment activity taking place? That's it, right? It's in that space, that safeguard validation space where we see most of this done. So if I was to really summarize, we can do risk assessment for the purpose of safeguard selection, but like I've said a couple times, very few organizations actually do that. But where most people do spend their time is risk assessment for the purpose of safeguard validation, right? That right-hand circle, and actually making sure, are we doing the things that we said we were going to do in order to achieve our objectives? So the way people are doing this is through sort of a combination of activities that, frankly, a lot of you have been talking about, have been doing possibly for years, right? Internal audits, formal external audits, pen tests, either internally or by third parties, control self-assessments. So people from first or second line possibly doing assessments internally in the organization. And so, but the thought process is that you're going to have a decision on, well, what is your target state? So you're going to say to yourself, we believe that we should do a risk assessment. And therefore, we say, okay, well, what are the safeguards we believe we should be doing? Okay, so do you have that library in place? And then if you look at yourself then in light of that library, that's the assessment that frankly, most of these regulators are looking for. So if you were to, again, have a regulator come in and say, okay, James, we want to prove that your organization is actually doing this requirement, that you're doing a risk assessment, what would that look like? They want to see probably some list of safeguards that you selected, and they want to see that you assess yourself in light of those requirements. When I say you, either you do it or a third party, however, again, you're going to actually have that accomplished. So ideally, what you would do is you would come up with a multi-year strategy for this, right? You would say, okay, we probably know we can't do a deep dive into all of our safeguards every year. And so what you might say is, okay, well, let's come up with a scope of what are all the scopes then that we need to look at some point, and then come up with a multi-year plan to look at those. And, a lot of times what I see in companies is, you might come up, like say internal audit might say, okay, it's November 24 right now, and, we know 25 is coming up. So we're going to go to the audit committee and say in 2025, these are the things we're going to assess ourselves against. And that's probably about the most audit planning that I ever see companies doing. They always say that they want to be flexible and be able to change their scope, because the risks are always changing, which is all true. But just because risks are changing, it doesn't necessarily mean that I shouldn't have a full scoped view of all those things that potentially need to be addressed, or the safeguards that need to be validated inside of an organization. Ideally, you would come up with a long-term plan to be able to do this. And I'll show students, or I've given this out as a template quite a few times to organizations where we sort of create this idea of, you can kind of see on the left, this idea of, here are some of the different templates, or I'm sorry, the different safeguard libraries that are out there, or safeguard topics or domains we would want to cover. And then we could make a decision. You see in the center section there is, okay, how often do we want to do those assessments? Like, is this something that we would do on a 1-year cycle? Do we do this on a 3-year cycle, on a 5-year cycle? I'd say the more important the scope is, maybe the more regularly we accomplish that scope. Like, for example, I know lots of organizations will do Sarbanes-Oxley reviews on an annual basis because, well, frankly, that's the requirement, right? That you do that kind of work regularly, especially looking at identity and access management. So maybe that becomes an annual scope for you. Maybe you want to look at a comprehensive cybersecurity scope once a year to get the big picture. But maybe on the other hand, things like, oh, I don't know, how is your mobile device management platform working? Maybe you say, you know what, let's look at that once a year, or once every 5 years, sorry. And we're not going to do a deep dive into mobile device management every single year. But what if we do that on every 5-year basis or an every 3-year basis or whatever your schedule is? So again, I just like this idea of organizations trying to plan out these assessments. And again, now this is something you can show your regulators. You can say, okay, you look in the far right, we spaced this out over time and we said, okay, in 2024, these are the scopes we're going to do. We're going to do one comprehensive assessment a year. That way we can sort of check that box for regulators that we've done a big assessment, but then we're going to cover these other scopes too. So you could show a regulator a long-term strategy, a long-term plan like this, and you could show them the results of each of the assessments. And I mean, that combination, I think, is a pretty powerful way to show and justify that you're doing the thing that organizations are being asked to do via these regulations. Now, the thing that I would say too is you might think to yourself, okay, well, but how do I actually do that? Like, what would that practically look like? And again, for the sake of time, in an hour, I probably don't have enough time to go through and teach everybody risk assessments. And frankly, that's why we have classes at SANS like LDR 419 and some of those that trying to teach people specifically what are the steps you would take in order to do a risk assessment. So that's actually why we wrote that class. But again, if I was just to give you just sort of maybe a quick view, at least to give you sort of a thought process to be able to visualize this, most of the time what you're doing is, since these are safeguard-centric approaches to risk assessment that we're dealing with, then often what we'll see people doing is doing risk assessment where we say, okay, here's the list of safeguards that we believe are appropriate and should be in place. And therefore, what we're going to do is let's track the status of those safeguards, evidence those safeguards are in place. Maybe we'll track exceptions, right? Think in a risk register. And be able to report those. And there's different tools we can use to do all those things. Like if you have a governance risk compliance engine, like a GRC tool, right? That might be one of the tools you want to use. A lot of people will use Microsoft Excel. And frankly, I'll tell you, I've been giving away Excel spreadsheets for people, for students for years. And I'm still a fan that, Excel is perfectly acceptable, right? It does the job. And if you're just getting started doing risk assessment, there's absolutely nothing wrong with using some of these Excel-based tools to track the status of the risk that's in place. We can get into automation like with CMDBs or cyber asset attack surface management, CASM products, business intelligence tools. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways you could potentially do this. The majority of organizations though that I talk to, and frankly, when I look, at the work that I do at Cyverity, sort of professionally, where I spend my time, is actually doing risk assessments of organizations. And frankly, most of my clients just prefer Excel because it's easy to use and it's easy to process. It doesn't take much to explain. So, for example, one of the things that we do then is we go ahead and we create tools that are either going to be compliance-based or more safeguards-based. So, for example, I did an assessment earlier this year, and I was asked to do a risk assessment based on the DFS NYCRR 500 requirements. So I just use Excel. Basically, I took a list of all the different requirements that were in that standard, put those into an Excel format, created some scoring if statements basically that I could use to go ahead and give myself ratings in each of those. And then you can see a little bit of the dashboard that I created, as a result of what I found. But basically, again, I just did this to be able to show overall compliance with a given standard. So I could do this kind of project where I could do this, again, based on really any specific cybersecurity standard. So if you're being asked to do a risk assessment and you're being asked to follow a very specific regulation, like again, let's say NYDFS or maybe some of the CMMC requirements or whatever it might be, then using something like that that's specifically targeted to that particular compliance standard might be a good idea. The other way that we've done this is, like I said earlier, is we found that a lot of organizations are in sort of this multi-framework world. And you're not just being asked to do one or two things. So what do you do now? One of the things that we did was to try to help create tools to address this multi-framework issue as well as part of that conversation. So over at crfsecure.org, we've created a bunch of resources to facilitate that. And one of those that we've used for multi-framework folks. So again, one option is if you say, I have just one standard I have to be compliant with, you could do something like, again, like a standard or compliance specific assessment tool that you sort of create based on the wording of the regulation itself. But again, if you find yourself in a situation where you have 5 standards, 10 standards, 12 standards you have to follow, maybe what you want to do is take all of those different standards, aggregate those into one common library, and then use that as an assessment. And so one of the tools that we give out is we have an Excel-based tool that we give people. In fact, I use this probably for the majority of the assessments that I perform. But again, if you go to crfsecure.org, there's a free download there that you can grab. If you want to do your own assessment, it sort of, again, it just creates these dashboards for you and lets you track the status of safeguards, those kinds of things. The downside about the Excel tools, I mean, again, I like them a lot. Some of the people I work with might say I have like an unhealthy love of Microsoft Excel, but the reality is it just works. And when I first started giving these tools away, maybe 15 plus years ago now, I did a lot of thought around this. And should I build like custom web applications, or should I create some sort of, back then, like Microsoft Access or database driven tools or whatever? But the thing that I found, and the feedback I got from students, was that it's just easy to use Excel. Everybody knows how to use it. I don't have to teach you how to use Excel. And we can make it simple enough where you can use things like drop-down choices and things like that to answer questions, and then automatically create these dashboards. And frankly, whether these dashboards, like you'll see here, come in from, say, something like Excel, or comes in because of a GRC database, I mean, people don't really care. They just want to know, what do I do because of this? Or have I met my obligation to do risk assessments with this? Or if it gives us to a third party, right? How do they score based on that? I mean, these are all things we could use. So the downside, of course, is that these are spreadsheets, and what that means is they're not databases. So the one thing that's a little bit harder is how do you then compare if you've done 5 of these in a row, 5 years in a row? How do you show progress? And that might be a little bit manual copying and pasting, or a little bit of Excel magic, maybe in a separate worksheet you create. But certainly you could go ahead and do that for sure. I know we are starting to move a little bit of our work over at CRF and Cyverity over to a web-based interface that we made. So probably going forward, we're going to probably do a little bit more using database-driven approaches. And we're doing some custom development to help support that. But we recognize most organizations aren't going to use those custom tools. So something like Excel-based assessment tools, again, if you're just saying to yourself, James, keep this simple for me. I need to follow these regs. What do I do? Well, a simple answer could be just go over to the website, download the Excel assessment tool, fill it out, and then give it to your regulators when they show up. It could be that simple that you could do to kind of go through some of this process. I mean, granted, there's probably a lot more that you'd want to do, but again, at a high level, that might be something you want to consider. And again, you can just see kind of the Q&A portion of it, right? So there's a couple different worksheets in those tools. Again, you see on the right, you just simply answer the questions from a dropdown. You see that the question there on the left, and then you have a tab dedicated to dashboards like we saw over here. So once you answer all those questions, you get these dashboards. You know where it is you need to focus your attention. So the reality is, one of the things that we think every organization has the potential to benefit from are these risk assessments. If you do a regular assessment, and so we assume the definition here is that for the majority of you, you're going to be doing these risk assessments for the purpose of validating that, are you implementing the safeguards that you believe are appropriate for you to achieve your mission? And not all of you may be mandated to do these, but I still think it's valuable for organizations, kind of no matter who you are, to do these assessments. Because what it does is it gives you a snapshot of where you are, where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, what you're doing well at, what you need to improve in, where your tech debt might be, those kinds of things. So again, regardless of whether you're required to by these regs or not, it would be something I would be considering doing. Now, again, you don't have to use the tools we use. You can kind of create your own, or you can download others, or use GRCs, or whatever you want to use. But you need to figure out what's your target state, and then track, are you doing the things that you said you're going to do? It's going to help you, by doing that, reduce uncertainty. It's going to give you data that you can share with business and engineering stakeholders. They can use that to make better decisions. And frankly, it's going to be something that your regulators are going to be happy with, because again, that's really what they're asking you to do. So not trying to overly, complicate things, but literally that sort of work is the focus of what a lot of these regulators want. Now, if you want to learn more, there's a lot of other places you can go. Like, for example, if you're trying to say, okay, well, James, which safeguards should we include? Every year I do a cybersecurity standard scorecard presentation, typically every fall. I just did one a couple months ago. So if you want to look at this year's version, basically we go through and we compare and contrast some of the different cybersecurity standards that are out there. We've got evaluation criteria that we use. We have sort of a scoring grading system we use. That might be something you want to use as you're getting started selecting your safeguards. SANS has a couple classes we've been putting out here the last couple of years. We just fully put out, well, we have a 2-day class on performing cybersecurity risk assessments, sort of a more in-depth version of what we just talked about here today. Sort of a 2-day class there. And then we've also just this year put out a 5-day version on full risk management and compliance for people looking for a little bit more depth and more of the philosophy of these risk management methodologies that are out there. A couple books too. I'm always a big fan. If you haven't read some of the Douglas Hubbard books, especially his first one, How to Measure Anything, some of the details in his later books don't always agree with. I think we get maybe a little bit more detail than maybe what some of things he writes about, but at least the early books I think conceptually make a lot of sense. Also been sort of really intrigued by some of Nassim Taleb's writings. He's got a few books on the subject. He writes from sort of a financial risk perspective, but I think a lot of what he talks about is very, very relevant to cyber as well. Fooled by Randomness, I think, is a good place to start if you want to try to tackle that. Make sure you definitely don't read that one late at night. Make sure you have lots of coffee and you're good and energized to get into his work. Read it nice and slow. It might take a little bit of time to digest, but it's good to consider if you're looking for a little bit more depth there in that space. And then the other resource I always want to give is my email. I've been giving it out for years now, and students have been super respectful of it over the years. But you'll see there on this last slide, you've got my email there. So if you do have further questions, you can feel free to reach out to me. Happy to provide feedback or information if it's something, whether you're listening live today or you're listening to this on YouTube down the road. We really are happy to answer questions. People tend not to abuse me, and as long as people don't abuse me, I'm happy to continue taking questions and answers that way as well. There are a few different questions that came into Q&A. I know we don't have a lot of time today, but just to answer a couple of these very, very quickly, and again, feel free to email me if you want more detail. How far are orgs expected to untangle their relationship with third parties and third parties, right? Or what we might call fourth party relationships. Most of the regs don't get into details on that. Most of the regulations want you to require your third parties to understand that there are rules that need to be followed and assess them based on those rules. And one of those assumptions is that your third parties will be assessing their third parties. So there's a rabbit hole that we can get into there for sure. Most of the regs are silent on this. But the issue is that at a minimum, you should come up with a list of standards that include third-party requirements and ask your third parties how they're doing on those safeguards. So for sure. When it comes to NIST 2, NIST 2 is a work in progress for sure. So I won't try to spend a lot of time on that one, but just know NIST 2 is a work in progress. The member states are in the process of releasing risk management requirements, but there is a risk management requirement in NIST 2 at a high level. So they are definitely asking you to do that as a part of that requirement, but the details of that are yet to be fleshed out. And there's a lot of work in progress still with the member states in the EU and what's going to happen there. So keep an eye on there. I'm sure we're going to be giving a lot more presentations at SANS as things like, that DORA, the Cyber Essentials, and those requirements really start to become more live. And then the last question here, just really quickly, do most companies leverage vulnerability management to identify vulnerabilities and patch the environment rather than have a proactive patch management process? I would say it's probably a combination of both. Most organizations I see will have a vulnerability management process, which is more of a validation process that the patching you're doing is working. And then there's a patch management process, which is a proactive process for pushing those out. So most organizations I see don't pick one or the other. They tend to try to do both. Sometimes they're better at one than the other, but definitely I see an approach where most organizations are trying to accomplish both simultaneously, which I think is probably the right thing to do. So again, I know we're running low on time here, but appreciate you all being able to join us here today. Hopefully we'll get a chance to see you on a future SANS webcast. I know we have more coming up here, and I'll be giving another one even next week on the NIST cybersecurity framework and the NIST CSF version 2. I'm glad to have you here, and hopefully we'll see you at a future SANS webcast.